Welcome, traveler, to Tales of Bygone Eras, where we together shall experience moments of tranquility through historical narratives tinged with gentle fantasy, guiding the soul to peaceful slumber.
Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly: the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies, a time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one's watching. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. We really appreciate your generosity and support of what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's begin tonight's somewhat boring medieval history journey. The biggest misconception about medieval intimacy is that it unfolded beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. And no, it wasn't some quaint studio apartment vibe you'd find on Airbnb. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered, so did volume, and ideally so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury, beds were shared, and even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner pretending not to notice anything. Can you imagine that? Oh, yes, Your Grace, I heard absolutely nothing of the "Oh, Godfrey, your sock" incident. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right. Total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple: no privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. Historians are still debating whether these walls were truly for deterring secret rendezvous or just for keeping hungry rabbits out of the vegetable patch. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that they definitely served a dual purpose.
In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else was distracting at best, sinful at worst. Can you imagine a checklist for that? Procreated? Good. Enjoyed it? Sin. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent? Also no. That left maybe Tuesdays in April? I picture medieval couples needing a calendar marked with huge no's. Even within marriage, there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is by all accounts a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries, they were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. Historians are still debating whether the church's control was truly effective or simply led to creative loopholes for couples. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that medieval people were just as good at finding workarounds as anyone else.
If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval soaks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of Saint Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The church had opinions, and by opinions, we mean strict prohibitions, on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Still no. Day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Yep, almost every day had something stopping you. Add in Lent, 40 days, Advent, another 40, various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. Like getting a speeding ticket, but for being too affectionate. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Historians are still debating whether this advice genuinely fostered piety or simply increased marital frustration. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that nobody likes being told to pray instead of cuddle. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of Saint Nun. Who cares about Saint Nun when you've got a rogue chicken to worry about? To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbors caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact.
Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad or watching a modern rom-com, because real life was just different. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbors who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Quite the guarantee, right? Courtship, when it happened, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely got alone time. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Romantic, eh? Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, tools, or the size of his ox. And women? They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. Would you pass that test? This doesn't mean love didn't exist. It did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Historians are still debating whether love developing after marriage was a sign of societal adaptation or simply acceptance of fate. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that regardless, humans still found ways to love despite the constraints.
Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. Or all of the above, which sounds like a really bad day. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Can you imagine a medieval blacksmith advertising chastity belts, now with rust-proof coating? Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailor advertised them, no laws regulated them, no churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes sense because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative, and nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. Historians are still debating the extent to which these stories reflect contemporary societal anxieties more than historical reality, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that humans always love a good fabricated tale, especially if it involves iron and whispers of fidelity.
In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators. And any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts long before the bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Yes, dancing was sometimes a serious sin. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations! You've grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Historians are still debating the extent to which the church truly managed to control these off-label activities, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that cold, hard cash always has a special persuasive power.
Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. Probably not where you want to find your meet cute. There were even handbooks. Yes, actual handbooks for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were cataloged, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval Tinder, it was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof, your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Clear priorities, right? Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive, and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. Imagine a bathhouse being shut down for too much scandal. Sounds like a TV drama. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume? Mostly for the elite. Deodorant? A dream of the distant future. Dental care? Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. Historians are still debating whether the acceptance of body odor was a necessary adaptation or simply that everyone smelled equally awful. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that true love, apparently, does not require a highly sensitive nose. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind and nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories, and probably made you look a bit silly to anyone watching. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen, soaked in various concoctions, was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax, and there are scattered references to, let's call them, medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The Church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Historians are still debating whether the ineffectiveness of these methods was a primary reason for medieval population growth or simply a reflection of human resilience. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that regardless, humans have always tried to control their destinies, even in the most trying circumstances. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was common enough to require a lot of paperwork, known as fornication in church records, and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Yep, medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will. And let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbors weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called handfasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple considered themselves betrothed, and in some regions that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality.
If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. Historians are still debating whether these handfastings were truly a legitimate form of marriage or simply a societal concession to an unavoidable reality. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that regardless, love and its complicated stories always find a way.
In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. Like, oops, you're a little early, but no worries, we'll still get married. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honor. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy, mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. Try telling a 14th century midwife she's doing it wrong. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet, like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean, cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Life just isn't fair, is it? Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honor and property claims. Historians are still debating the extent to which this concept shaped the roles of women in medieval society, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that honor was a very valuable currency back then.
So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality. It was legal currency. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century. But if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights, and all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman, within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labeled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Yes, quite the interesting sin list. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing.
Noble women sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All-male monasteries and all-female convents created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, there were feelings involved, and possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. You just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saint stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Historians are still debating the extent to which medieval society recognized or tolerated these relationships, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that love always finds a way to exist, no matter the barriers.
Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride or property. Let's be clear. Adultery wasn't just a personal failing, it was a social offense. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts, they were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. A real messy business, wasn't it? For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or, in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but not legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. Double standards already a thing. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift, or having to pay for a new church bell because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. Historians are still debating whether these unusual punishments were effective deterrents or simply public spectacles, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that people always love to see someone else in trouble. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law, it was the husband. Honor killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval customs sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, annulments, or decades-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip.
In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yeses. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right, two people saying, "I will," in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic? Possibly. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice.
especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied. But in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local Ree's son, riskier still. Would you dare? Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centers like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at least making a public stink. The power of public shaming was real. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they ignored the answer. Historians are still debating whether these tales reflected reality or simply ideals of love and power, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that, regardless, humans always struggle to be heard.
If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complicated, it was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred, ideally, that nothing too enjoyable was going on. Imagine a pleasure monitor, but with robes and scriptures. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation. Extreme moderation, like once a month. In the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live incontinently, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers, like St. Jerome, went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. Quite the unromantic vision of marriage, wasn't it? This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture that. You're trying to confess to stealing a loaf of bread, and the priest is asking about excessive affection with your wife. Quite the fun confession session. Furthermore, some scholars argue that this emphasis on restraint and procreation wasn't just about morality, but also about social control. By tightly regulating such a private aspect of life, the church could reinforce its authority over individuals and families. It was a way of reminding people that even their most intimate behaviors were under divine and clerical scrutiny. Historians are still debating whether these rules were primarily about spiritual elevation or maintaining social order. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that, whatever the motivation, medieval private life was certainly no free-for-all.
Picture the look on a 14th century friar's face, pursed in disapproval, as you confess to being too passionate with your spouse. This level of church scrutiny delved deep into the marital bed,
turning the most intimate moments into a subject for introspection and penance. And just when you think things can't get more complex, let's pivot to another topic intimately linked with intimacy and daily life: death. Sure, it seems like a leap from the bedroom to the graveyard, but in the Middle Ages, the two were often surprisingly intertwined. Both sex and death were inescapable parts of life, and both were heavily regulated by the church and society. Well, who knew your first dates would involve contemplating mortality? Literally. For medieval people, death wasn't a distant event, sanitized in hospital morgues and solemn ceremonies. It was a constant companion, ever present. Infants died, plagues swept through, wars raged. Life expectancy was low, and any given day could truly be your last. This fostered a significantly different attitude towards existence and what you did with your time. If you were planning on living a sinful life, then sudden death was a real concern, because without time to confess, you could be headed straight for hell. The church, once again, had a lot to say about death. It was seen as the gateway to eternity, and how you lived your life would determine where you ended up. Imagery of death, particularly the danse macabre, or dance of death, where death leads figures from all walks of life away inexorably, was very common. These images weren't for entertainment, rather a stark reminder of life's transience and the need to live a virtuous life. Yeah, something to chew on when you're just trying to have a good day. There were even concepts like the ars moriendi, or art of dying. These were guidebooks written to instruct people on how to die a good death, with prayers, rituals, and advice on how to fend off the devil's last temptations. It was like the ultimate self-help book, actually probably more detailed than most IKEA manuals today. A good death, one of contrition and preparation, was paramount. This anxiety about death also filtered into relationships. Some might rush into marriage to secure heirs and succession before an illness struck. Others might choose a monastic life, abstaining entirely to prepare themselves for eternity. Historians are still debating the extent to which the omnipresence of death shaped medieval societal behaviors and morality, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that regardless, having a spiritual contingency plan was always a good idea.
Even if the concept of death seems far removed from the bedroom, the pervasive anxiety about preparing for the afterlife certainly influenced every personal life decision, including whether you should indulge in worldly matters. Now, let's shift to another aspect of medieval intimacy that's often overlooked but was a crucial part of life: friendship and community ties. We tend to think of sex and marriage as individual, private relationships, but in the Middle Ages, they were always interwoven with the broader social fabric. Yeah, no real friend zone when all your friends knew all your business. Medieval communities were often very small and tight-knit. People lived in close proximity, worked together, and frequently shared everything from tools to gossip. This meant that relationships were built on interdependence. You needed your neighbors to help with the harvest, to mend a roof, or simply to share a story by the fire. These relationships were often deep and lifelong. Friendship wasn't just about having someone to confide in. It was a social safety net. If you fell on hard times, you relied on your friends and family for support. However, the flip side of this closeness was the lack of privacy. As we've discussed, everybody knew everybody's business. If a couple engaged in behavior that wasn't socially approved, or if an affair took place, news would travel as fast as wildfire. This created a strong pressure to conform to social and religious norms. Public shame was a powerful tool to keep people in line. Imagine Facebook, but everyone on it is your nosy great aunt. Community rituals also played a significant role in reinforcing social bonds and norms. Festivals, markets, church services, these were all occasions for people to gather, socialize, and observe one another. These occasions often had aspects of fun and revelry, but they were also places where social rules were implicitly enforced. A disapproving glance, a whispered comment, or a slight snub could be a more powerful punishment than any fine. In a society without mass media or easy travel, the community was your world. Your relationships with neighbors, friends, and family members were fundamental to your survival and well-being. Historians are still debating whether this level of social scrutiny was a burden or a stabilizing factor in medieval life. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that, regardless, nobody likes being that closely watched.
In a society where interdependence was key, personal relationships were governed by the needs of the entire community. This leads us to another facet of medieval social life that's often forgotten: the role of laughter and humor in coping with life's hardships. While medieval life was certainly fraught with challenges, plagues, wars, famine, and even those strict church rules about bedroom antics, humans still found joy and reasons to laugh. Laughter was a powerful tool for stress relief, social bonding, and even subtly critiquing things that couldn't be changed. Who doesn't need a good laugh on a bad day? Festivals, whether religious or secular, were often occasions for revelry and letting loose. During these days, social rules could be bent a little. Coarse jokes, witty songs, and silly theatrical performances were often part of the celebration. This allowed people to blow off steam and temporarily escape the strictures of daily life. Think of the guild artisans putting on funny plays in the market square, often poking fun at those in power. Mirth, a cruder and lower social form of humor, was also prevalent. This involved jokes about bodily functions, sex, or awkward church situations. The kind of stuff you probably wouldn't see on a history YouTube channel today. These jokes, while perhaps uncultured to modern ears, served an important purpose. They allowed people to mock taboos, gently challenge authority, and create a sense of camaraderie through shared laughter. Maybe that's why we still have raunchy comedies today. And let's not forget the professional entertainers, the storytellers, musicians, and traveling comedians. These individuals moved from village to village, bringing tales, songs, and jokes to amuse the populace. They were the YouTube stars of their era, often carrying news and laughter from the outside world. Some of their stories, especially those involving cheating spouses or greedy clerics, would certainly have had the crowd roaring. Even in serious manuscripts, you might find humorous or bizarre marginalia. Little drawings of animals playing instruments, monks being attacked by rabbits, or strange everyday scenes. These were the quiet laughs of the scribes, a way to keep their sanity during repetitive work. Historians are still debating whether these jokes truly signify a less severe society, or were merely coping mechanisms for immense pressures. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that no matter how tough life gets, humans always find a reason to crack a smile. Humor, whether crude or subtle, was an essential part of medieval life, a reminder that even in the toughest times, humans needed laughter to maintain their spirits. We've talked a lot about restrictions and rules, but now let's glide into another topic you might not expect when thinking about the Middle Ages: the ideal of romantic love, what we often call courtly love. This was a complex concept, and often in direct contradiction to the marital realities we've already discussed. Yep, like expecting a romance novel but getting a financial report instead. Courtly love was an idea that flourished among the nobility in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in southern France. It was expressed through poetry, songs, and the tales of troubadours and knights. The central idea was a noble, unrequited, or forbidden love, often between a knight and a married woman, frequently his lord's wife. Yes, a messy scenario from the get-go. This wasn't a physical love, but rather a spiritual and intellectual devotion. The knight would perform acts of bravery, write poetry praising the lady's beauty, and endure all manner of suffering for her.
In return, he would receive an approving glance, a handkerchief, or a mysterious smile. The purpose was the knight's moral and spiritual improvement, making him more noble and honorable. Sounds like a self-improvement course, but with armor and long poems. Crucially, courtly love was often seen as antithetical to marriage. Marriage was about land, dowries, and lineage. Courtly love was about emotion, devotion, and ideals. This created an interesting tension in aristocratic society where romantic ideals often clashed with the harsh realities of arranged marriages. Historians are still debating whether courtly love was ever truly practiced or merely an artistic form and social game, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that, regardless, humans still crave romance, even if it's only on paper. And just when you think you've got it all figured out, remember that courtly love also had its own elaborate rules, sometimes as complex and contradictory as those of the church. There were debates about whether true love could exist within marriage, and often the answer was no. It had to be a perpetual pursuit, never fully attained. This led to dramatic and often tragic tales, pining knights and conflicted ladies. It was a kind of love complicated, like most things medieval.
And while courtly love remained a distant ideal for most medieval people, it speaks to an important aspect of human nature, the yearning for something beyond harsh reality. It was a way to dream, even if those dreams never fully materialized. Now, let's transition to a less romantic but incredibly practical topic in medieval life: violence and its consequences on personal relationships. Unfortunately, violence was a common part of life during this era, ranging from warfare and feudal disputes to individual assaults and domestic conflict. Definitely not a lighthearted romance movie. In a society where legal institutions were often weak and law enforcement uneven, self-help, or the resolution of disputes through violence, was a frequent occurrence. Arguments in the street could quickly escalate to fights with knives or staves. Family feuds could last centuries, with successive generations continuing the cycle of vengeance. This created an atmosphere of fear and instability for many. And when violence occurred within the home, the consequences could be particularly devastating. In a patriarchal society where husbands had significant legal control over their wives and children, domestic violence was not uncommon. The church, while officially condemning violence, often had complex views on interfering in family matters, like a don't get involved in other people's business scenario, but far worse. Medieval court records sometimes document cases of violence, ranging from assaults to homicides. Women could seek redress through ecclesiastical or secular courts. This was often difficult and dangerous. The lack of evidence, the fear of retaliation, and the lack of community support could leave victims vulnerable. Historians are still debating the full extent of domestic violence in the Middle Ages, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that it was certainly a distressing reality. While this topic can be unsettling, acknowledging the presence of violence is crucial to a comprehensive understanding of medieval life. It reminds us that alongside the tales of courtly love and chivalric legends, there was a harsh reality where personal safety and well-being were frequently at risk. And it also shows that the complex social issues we face today are not new, but have existed in various forms throughout history.
The pervasive presence of violence, whether on a grand scale or within the smallest domestic unit, serves as a stark reminder that medieval life wasn't always fairy tales and love ballads. It was a society fraught with peril, where personal existence was constantly at stake. Finally, let's close our journey through medieval intimate life with a topic that might be somewhat surprising: mental and emotional well-being. While we don't have modern concepts of psychology or therapy from that era, medieval people certainly experienced a full range of emotions and struggled with inner turmoil. Yep, they had bad days too, just without coffee and Netflix to get through them. Life in the Middle Ages was filled with significant stressors: pervasive famine, recurring plagues, warfare, high infant mortality rates, and economic instability. These factors undoubtedly took a psychological toll. The fear of starvation, sudden death, or the loss of loved ones was a daily concern. How do you maintain cheerfulness when life seems constantly on the brink of disaster? The Church, with its emphasis on sin, repentance, and eternal damnation, could also be a significant source of mental strain. The weight of guilt for transgressions, even minor ones, could be immense. The fear of hell and divine punishment was a very real, lived reality. Yet the Church also provided a spiritual support network through prayer, ritual, and community. For many, faith was a crucial source of comfort and hope in an uncertain world. Medieval people also experienced intense emotions: love, grief, jealousy, anger. These emotions are reflected in their literature, poetry, and historical records. Stories of lost love, betrayal, or unwavering loyalty all demonstrate the richness of emotional life. However, the ways they processed these emotions might have been very different from us. There was likely no concept of talking about your feelings as we have today. Instead, these emotions might have been expressed through action, through silence, or through physical manifestations. Public weeping at funerals, for example, was commonplace. Brawling and fighting were also regular occurrences. Historians are still debating how best to interpret the emotional lives of medieval people, with fragmented evidence and very few direct accounts of inner struggles. But the internet and tea houses have confirmed that regardless, humans have always had feelings, and that's a complicated thing. All right, everyone, the hour is late, and our journey through the medieval era has come to a gentle close. Take a deep breath and feel the quiet settling around you. We've explored a world so different from our own, sometimes strange, sometimes challenging, but always profoundly human. The people who lived through those times also faced their own worries, found their own joys, and held their own secrets, just like us. Perhaps they lacked the conveniences we have, the privacy we cherish, but they found ways to endure, to love, and to live. Now, let these images and stories slowly fade from your mind, like morning mist. Close your eyes, feel the warmth of your covers, and let your mind drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. It's all done now, and you've had quite the interesting journey.